In 1924, a pleasure craft carrying 7 passengers set out across Montana's Silver Pine Lake on what should have been a routine crossing. The water was calm, the summer sky cloudless, and the new gasoline engine hummed with modern reliability. But halfway across that vast glacial lake, something rose from the depths, something that shouldn't exist in fresh water, something that left the boat's paint scraped and its passengers forever changed. They weren't the first to see it, and they wouldn't be the last. I was 32 years old in the summer of 1924, working as an engineer for the Northern Pacific Railway out of Ridgewood, Montana. My name is Leonard Harper, and what I am about to tell you, I have only spoken of twice before, once to my wife and once to a reporter who chose not to print it. But I'm old now, and the truth weighs heavier than reputation. That July, I had taken a week's leave to visit my sister Eleanor in Lakewood at the southern tip of Silver Pine Lake. With me were 6 others. Eleanor's husband, Charles, a banker with soft hands but sharp eyes. My colleague, Henry Collins, who ran freight schedules and knew every inch of track from here to Seattle. The Brennan brothers, Samuel and Robert, who owned a timber operation near Summers. Clara Whitfield, a widow who taught school in Ridgewood, and young Michael Young, barely 20, whom Charles had hired to run the boat. The boat itself was Charles's pride, a 26-foot launch with a covered cockpit and a new 4-cylinder engine capable of pushing us along at 12 knots. He had had it shipped from Detroit that spring, the first gasoline pleasure craft on Silver Pine Lake that wasn't built for logging or fishing. The locals called it wasteful. Charles called it progress. We set out from Lakewood at 9 in the morning, intending to cross to Golden Bay and return before evening. The lake stretched before us like a sheet of dark blue glass, 28 miles long and 15 wide at its broadest point. The Mission Mountains rose to the east, still carrying snow despite the July heat. To the west, the Salish Mountains formed a green wall that seemed to hold the sky in place. The water that day was peculiar, not rough, but restless. Small wavelets moved in patterns that didn't match the wind. Michael noticed it first, adjusting our heading several times to compensate for currents that shouldn't have existed in a lake. "It's the depth," Henry said, lighting his pipe. "This lake goes down over 300 feet in places. Water that deep has its own ideas." Clara Whitfield sat near the stern with her parasol, though the covered cockpit made it unnecessary. She had a notebook in her lap, sketching the shoreline. The Brennan brothers passed a flask between them, discussing timber prices. Eleanor and Charles sat close together near the bow, her hand on his arm, both smiling at the novelty of racing across water without sails or oars. I stood beside Michael at the wheel, watching the engine's gauge and listening to the steady rhythm of the pistons. Everything mechanical has a song if you know how to hear it, and this engine sang smooth and clear. We were perhaps 40 minutes out when the engine's song changed, just a note, a slight hesitation in rhythm. I leaned forward to check the gauges. Oil pressure normal, temperature steady. But there it was again, a faint shudder that traveled through the deck boards. "Feel that?" I asked Michael. He nodded, frowning. "Started about a minute ago. Current, maybe." The water ahead looked the same as it had all morning, dark and mostly calm, with those odd little crosshatches of wavelets. But now I noticed something else. The surface, about 30 yards to starboard, had a different quality, smoother than the surrounding water, as if something beneath was dampening the waves. I started to speak, "Michael," but Robert Brennan interrupted first. "What's that there?" He pointed at the smooth patch. We all turned to look. The area was growing larger, spreading outward in a slow circle. The water there looked almost oily, though I could see no actual oil. It reflected the sky differently, darker despite the bright sun. "Probably a cold upwelling," Henry said, but his voice carried doubt, thermal layers mixing. The smooth patch drifted closer, or we drifted toward its edge, I couldn't tell which. Michael adjusted the wheel to steer around it, but the current seemed to pull us along its edge. The engine stuttered once, then resumed its rhythm. Eleanor stood up, shading her eyes with her hand. "There's something underneath," she said quietly. She was right. Below the smooth water, perhaps 10 feet down, a shadow moved. Not the scattered darkness of a school of fish or the straight line of a submerged log. This shadow had substance and form, though I couldn't make out its exact shape through the distortion of the water. "How big is it?" Clara asked, gripping her notebook against her chest. No one answered, because no one could tell. The shadow seemed to shift and flow beneath us, sometimes compact, sometimes stretched out. The boat was 26 feet long and the shadow was longer. "Hold steady," Charles said to Michael, although the young man was already white-knuckling the wheel. "We'll pass it soon." But we didn't pass it. The shadow paced us, staying just to starboard, maintaining the same speed. The smooth patch of water moved with it, and now I could see the water actually swirling at its edges very slowly, as if something large was displacing it from below. Samuel Brennan, the elder brother, reached for the boat hook mounted along the rail. "Maybe we should—" The impact cut him off. Something struck the hull from below, not hard enough to breach it, but solid enough to lift the stern several inches. Clara cried out. Eleanor grabbed Charles's arm. The flask slipped from Robert's hand and shattered on the deck. "Jesus Christ!" Michael breathed. The engine sputtered, caught, sputtered again. I lunged for the controls, adjusting the throttle to keep it running. Without the engine, we'd drift at the mercy of whatever was beneath us. "It hit us," Samuel said unnecessarily, still gripping the boat hook like a weapon. "No," Henry said, his pipe now forgotten. "It bumped us. There's a difference." He was right. Whatever had touched our hull had done so almost gently, like a curious investigation rather than an attack. But that made it worse somehow. A mindless collision would have been easier to accept than something deliberate. The shadow circled now, moving from starboard to port, passing directly beneath us. And as it did, I saw more clearly through the water. A body thick and elongated, dark gray or brown, with a surface that looked rough, almost corrugated. It flexed as it moved, muscular and powerful. No fins that I could see, but something else, projections along its sides that might have been flippers or legs. I couldn't tell. "That's no fish," Robert said hoarsely. "I seen it. Sturgeon get big in deep lakes," Charles offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Not that big," I replied, "and sturgeon don't move like that." The thing circled now and rose slightly, perhaps only 5 feet below the surface. For the first time, I could make out what might have been a head, broader than the body, flat on top, with a blunt front end. The water above it humped upward, not breaking the surface, but creating a visible swell that rolled outward.
Michael tried to steer away, but the thing matched our movement. When he turned to port, it shifted to port. When he straightened, it straightened. It was following us or watching us. I couldn't decide which was worse. "More throttle!" Charles commanded. I opened it up, and the engine responded, pushing us from 8 knots to 10, then 12. The boat lunged forward, spray breaking over the bow. For a moment, I thought we'd left it behind. Then, the water ahead exploded. Not violently, more like a slow-motion fountain. Water rose in a column, and within that column, something solid and dark breached the surface. I saw it clearly for perhaps 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds burned into my memory with the clarity of a photograph. A head. Yes, but unlike any animal I knew. Flat and wide, perhaps 6 feet across, with skin that looked like weathered leather. 2 eyes set far apart, black and round, each the size of a dinner plate. No visible nostrils, but a mouth, running nearly the width of the head, closed but unmistakably there. The line of it was visible like a seam in the flesh. It rose perhaps 4 feet out of the water, paused as if taking our measure, then slid back down with barely a splash. The water closed over it, smooth and dark. Clara fainted, folding backward, and only Samuel's quick reaction kept her from striking her head on the deck. Eleanor made a sound I'd never heard from my sister before, something between a gasp and a moan. The bread and Brummers cursed in unison. "Full throttle, now!" Charles shouted. But I was already doing it, pushing the engine harder than was safe. The boat surged forward, bow lifting, stern digging deep. Behind us, the water churned white in our wake. None of us looked back. We fixed our eyes on the distant shore and wheeled it closer. The thing followed. I couldn't see it anymore, but I felt it. The way you feel a storm approaching. The water to our port side would occasionally smooth out, or a swell would appear where no swell should be. Once, something scraped along our hull, a sound like fingernails on wood if fingernails were made of stone. The paint there, we'd later find, was scraped down to bare wood in 4 parallel lines, each as thick as my thumb. Michael held our course steady. His jaw clenched so tight I feared he'd crack teeth. The engine ran hot but true, singing its mechanical song at a pitch I'd never asked it of it before. The shore grew slowly larger, too slowly. At full throttle, we were perhaps making 14 knots, and Golden Bay was still 10 minutes away. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing was gone. No dramatic departure, no final surface breach. The water around us simply returned to normal. Normal waves, normal color, normal movement. The oppressive sense of being followed lifted like morning fog. We maintained full throttle anyway until easing only when the engine gauge crept into the red. Even then, we kept our speed up until we were in water shallow enough to see the bottom, maybe 20 feet. Only then did Michael's hands relax on the wheel. Only then did any of us speak. "What in God's name was that?" Robert asked. No one answered. What could we say? We'd all seen it, but seeing and understanding are different things. We reached Golden Bay and tied up at the small dock there. Clara had recovered, but remained pale and wouldn't leave the boat until Charles and I nearly carried her off. The rest of us stood on solid ground looking back at the lake, which now appeared peaceful and ordinary under the afternoon sun. "We tell no one," Charles said firmly, "not a soul." "There's something in that lake," Henry said. "Something that's probably been there before white men ever saw this water. The Quiddinai and sailors have stories going back generations." "You think they're all lies?" Samuel asked. "Stories aren't proof," Charles countered. "Then what do you call what we just saw?" I asked. He had no answer for that. We stayed in Golden Bay for 3 hours, ostensibly resting and having lunch at the small hotel there, but really gathering courage for the return crossing. Charles wanted to follow the shoreline back, adding hours to the journey but keeping us in shallow water. Michael outright refused to captain the boat again. In the end, it was Clara Whitfield who settled it. "We cross straight back," she said, quietly but firmly. "If we sneak along the shore like cowards, that thing wins. Besides, it had its chance at us. If it wanted to do more than investigate, it would have." So, we crossed back. I took the wheel this time, Michael tending the engine. We made the journey in tense silence, every ripple suspicious, every shadow threatening. But the lake remained just a lake. We reached Lakewood as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the water gold and red. That night, Charles and I examined the hull by lantern light. The scrape marks were undeniable. 4 parallel gouges, each about 8 feet long, running along the side-barred side. The wood was deeply scored but not penetrated. Whatever it touched us had done so almost gently, considering its apparent size and strength. Claws, perhaps? Charles suggested. Or something else, I replied, something we don't have a word for. We told the local dockman that we had scraped against a submerged log. He looked at the marks strangely but said nothing. Perhaps other boats had returned with stories they could not tell. I left Lakewood 2 days later, taking the train back to Ridgewood. As we skirted the lake's eastern shore, I stood on the rear platform watching the water. It looked so ordinary in daylight, just a big mountain lake full of snowmelt and fish. But I knew better now. So did the others. Henry never spoke of it at work, but sometimes I caught him staring at maps of the lake with a peculiar expression. The Brennan brothers sold their timber operation the following year and moved to Oregon. Clara continued teaching but never again accepted invitations to lake outings. Eleanor and Charles sold the boat that autumn, the buyer paying half what Charles had spent, and he seemed relieved to see it go. For me, I transferred to the Great Falls Division in 1925. The Missouri River runs through that country, shallow and clear, its bottom visible even at the deepest points. That suits me fine. But sometimes in dreams, I am back on Silver Pine Lake on that July morning. The water is smooth and dark, and something immense moves beneath us, curious and ancient, utterly beyond understanding. In those dreams, it surfaces fully, revealing its entire form, and I wake with my heart pounding, grateful that even in sleep, my mind refuses to complete the picture. Over the years, I have read other accounts, other sightings, other encounters. 1900, 1910, 1928, 1932. Reports cluster in summer months when the lake is busy with boats. Descriptions vary but share common elements. Enormous size, serpentine movement, broad, flat head, parallel scrapes on hulls. Skeptics blame sturgeon, logs, waves, or whiskey. Let them. Those of us who've seen it know better. The Silver Pine Lake Monster, they call it now, as if naming it makes it less real. But it is no legend. It remains in those deep glacial waters, living, hunting, watching. I am 93 years old now, telling this in 1991, speaking into my granddaughter's tape recorder because she's collecting what she calls oral histories. I have carried this story for 64 years. Soon I will be gone, but the thing in the lake will not. It was there before me, and it will be there long after the last person who reads this is dust. That is the truth. That is what we saw that July morning in 1924, when progress met prehistory on Silver Pine Lake, and prehistory scraped our hull just to let us know it was there. Sometimes knowing something exists is worse than never knowing at all.